All right, everyone. This is your brain, or the brain. Just to give you an idea, before you write that, I'm going to eventually erase it to tell you all the things that are in the brain, so just a title for your understanding of what the heck we're talking about. In case you didn't recognize that as the brain, that is what it is. All right, we're going to talk about the brain in terms of its structures and parts of the brain, and then we'll talk about the functions of those structures individually. So please feel free to pause or slow down this video. You can watch it at a reduced speed on YouTube, faster speed on YouTube if you're quick. Here we go. The brain's broken up into different sections. We call those sections lobes, at least this part of the brain. We'll talk more about different structures in the brain a little later. Frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Those are the four lobes of your cerebrum. We'll also note the cerebellum and the brainstem in this video. The frontal lobe, as we learn more and more about it, we can actually break it up further into the premotor cortex and the motor cortex, and the parietal lobe we can break up into the sensory cortex. So here they are shaded a little bit differently so you can see them kind of pop out. We've got our premotor cortex, our motor cortex, and our primary sensory cortex. All right, now that we have the structures of the brain mapped out, what we're going to do now is actually look at the functions of those structures. This is going to become really important because next week we're going to be doing a brain dissection. I'll give you the guide and I'll embed videos of me dissecting the brain throughout that guide so that you can have an idea of what it's going to look like and follow along as though you were doing the dissection. So, frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is responsible for what we call executive functions, the things that separate us from all other animals. Our higher level problem solving, our emotional traits, what makes us us, our reasoning and judgment, our speaking, and our voluntary motor activity, which actually relates more to those now that we have learned a little more about the brain. A way to think about the frontal lobe is that it determines whether or not everything else your brain is telling it is actually worth doing right now. What I mean by that is if you sit down at a table and you're incredibly hungry and your food is set down in front of you, but other people don't have their food yet, your brain is telling you, we're hungry, we should eat. But your frontal lobe tells you, no, that wouldn't be socially acceptable, and so you wait until everyone else has their food. So your frontal lobe is responsible for cueing social norms and regulating the other parts of your brain. The other parts of your brain, more basic, they're basically, when I feel this, let's do this, what are we waiting for? And your frontal lobe sort of tells your other parts of the brain to pump the brakes. Premotor cortex, motor cortex. Motor stands for movement, so this voluntary motor activity that is attributed to the frontal lobe, those parts of your brain specifically, the premotor cortex and motor cortex, are responsible for a lot of that voluntary movement. The primary sensory cortex is responsible for, as you would guess, feeling sensations and processing those sensations. So a lot of your sensory input goes there, with the exception of your sight, which we'll talk about in a moment. Parietal lobe, knowing right from left and being able to distinguish that. Sensation, which we now know is mostly in the primary sensory cortex. And reading is a function of your parietal lobe. Also body orientation, so where you are in space, is a function of the parietal lobe. Sensation, now we know, is in the primary sensory cortex. Your occipital lobe, basically vision and color perception. Occipital lobe, super important for vision. It's interesting that it's in the back of your head, furthest away from the brain, furthest away from your eyes. When we do the dissection, we'll talk about why that is. An interesting thing about the occipital lobe, there's something called Anton syndrome. Anton syndrome is this really fascinating but super rare disorder where people will go blind as a result of Anton syndrome, but deny that they are. So whenever they're asked a question about vision, they will lie and make up an answer rather than admitting that they cannot see. Super fascinating. Not next week, because next week will be dissections, but the week after that, you'll be putting together a nervous system presentation based on a trauma to a particular part of the brain and what happens, or some other degenerative brain activity or disorder or syndrome. And there's some really interesting ones out there. So Anton syndrome, a little allusion to that. Cerebellum is responsible for balance, coordination and control of voluntary movement, and fine muscle control. So your cerebellum and your premotor cortex and motor cortex work hand in hand. Motor cortex says we ought to fire that muscle. Cerebellum sort of does the fine tuning and coordinates the firing of that muscle. Brainstem is responsible for breathing, body temperature, digestion, alertness and sleep, and swallowing. Brainstem is basically responsible for keeping us alive. That's its job. We don't want to have to think about breathing. We don't want to have to think about body temperature or digesting or swallowing. All those things the brainstem takes care of for us. So we don't actually have to give cognitive brain function to it. Our frontal lobe doesn't have to think about that. Our brainstem just takes over. But our frontal lobe can override it to a certain point. Like, you can hold your breath. You can swallow at your leisure. You can do some things that are contrary to what the brainstem would want you to do. The brainstem wants you to breathe about 15 to 20 times a minute, and it'll do that when you're not thinking about it. But if you think about it, you can control your breathing and alter it. So frontal lobe can have some effect on the brainstem. And last, your temporal lobe. It's for understanding language, behavior, memory, and hearing. All right, that is your brain in a nutshell. Come to any Zoom meeting that you have a question on, and I would love to clarify any of these things. Know these structures of the brain, otherwise the dissection next week will be far more challenging, and you'll kind of have to do double learning. You'll have to learn what all of these things do in order to then identify them on the brain. All right, thanks very much for listening.